In this section, we'll show you how to write a script to monitor a given service on your system. Now, let's say, for example, you have a troubled service which happens to stop sporadically, and you'd like to have some sort of automated routine, such as a script, like which we'll write, to monitor the service and attempt to restart the service at X number of intervals, or for X number of intervals up to a certain threshold. So let's go off to writing a script. We'll be watching, for example, the MySQL service, and we'll allow the script to attempt to restart it perhaps 3 times. Let's go into temp 2, and we'll call this script monitor service.shell script. So let's touch monitor service.shell. We'll pico it and put the typical headers in. And we should be off to writing the script. Now, as we've shown you before, MySQL binds to port 3306. That should come as no surprise. So if you'd like to monitor MySQL activity, especially from a network perspective, you should be concerned with port 3306. Certainly you can check the availability of a service via built-in utilities such as service, or you can check it in the var run directory where many daemons create lock files. However, the emphasis here is on network accessibility. Even if the SQL database, the MySQL database, is being accessed locally, chances are likely that the application that binds to it locally binds to port 3306. So what we want to do is run a command that will tell us whether or not the port is available, port 3306. That command is the netstat command. So we'll run netstat ant. ANT filters out all other types of protocols such as UDP. ANT displays only TCP packets, or TCP protocols, TCP ports. We'll grep for port 3306, and of course if your MySQL daemon is bound to a different port, just specify the port here or variabilize the port using positional parameters. Now we need some variables. We need a variable for the status of MySQL. So let's set one called MySQL status. This will run immediately after, or this will be ascertained immediately after the running of netstat. This will be equivalent to the output, the echoed output of the exit status of the netstat command. So if netstat is successful, we'll get a return value of 0. If not, we'll get a return value of 1. So we have a variable MySQL status. We also want to set a count. The count is going to help us because in this example we'll be using a while loop, and we'd like the while loop to count from, or to run from count up to a certain threshold that we define, which again can be modified using positional parameters. We'll set the count to 0. We also need a threshold variable. The threshold is the maximum number of times that we'd like the script to attempt to restart the service. Let's set the threshold to 2. If we have a count from 0 to 2, then the while loop will run 3 times. It'll run once for 0, once for 1, and once for 2. So we'll have the while loop run 3 iterations to attempt to restart the service. Usually it doesn't take that much, but you figure after 3 failures, then someone, perhaps the administrator, should be notified. Excellent. So we have MySQL status, count, threshold. Now we need some sort of logic to check whether or not MySQL is actually running. So we have all these things stored in variables. Let's run an if. And the if will check to see whether or not it's running. We'll do an if MySQL status, and if MySQL status is running, or is not equal to 0, that is, because if it's not equal to 0, that means it's not running. If MySQL status is not equivalent to 0, then perform actions that are appropriate. Then we open the body of our condition and we're off to the races with performing the while loop. So nested within the if, we're going to put our while loop, which will in itself will have its own if, or its own conditional testing. We need an outside conditional tester, in this case the if conditional tester, for the variable MySQL status, because the first thing we want to know in running this script is whether or not the service is running. So that's the main reason for performing any other work. If MySQL status is not equal to 0, then we need to take some actions to correct the situation. If it is equal to 0, then we can exit and not do anything else. Excellent. So let's go into the body of this conditional. We have our then set up. Now we need to define a while loop because we want the while loop to run 3 times. This is where while loops or until loops can help us out. So here we'll say something like while count. Now we're actually watching the count variable. So while the count variable, which is currently 0, is less than or equal to the threshold is 2. If it's less than or equal to threshold, then we'll have it do our bidding, and the end is to finish by saying done. So within or between the do and the done, we'll get our work done. Let's move up a little bit so you can see. So within the while loop, we'll perform the magic 3 times necessary to enable this thing to work. The first thing we want to attempt to do, since we're in the body of the while loop, is attempt to start the MySQLD service. Now, if you're on a Red Hat-based system, there's a utility called service, a script called service that will run arguments against services for you, such as start, stop, restart, etc. So instead of actually specifying etc init.d and a service name, we can just specify the service utility and ask that service actually attempt to start for us MySQLD. So we'll ask service to start MySQLD. Now we need to do some logic to see whether or not the start was successful. So service MySQLD start, this is in the first iteration of the loop. Now let's just recap real quickly. We have a conditional, a test, which tests whether or not MySQL status is equivalent to 0. If it's not equal to 0, then it goes into the body of the conditional, which contains a while loop. If it is equal to 0, we'll have an else section down here, which says something like else echo service name is running. And we'll put that in a second. We also need to define a variable for service name. That would be nice, so that we don't have to hardwire it. So let's do that now. We'll call right here service name, and we'll say that service name is equal to MySQLD. This way we can reuse it. And now instead of saying service MySQLD, we simply variabilize it. Always good to use variables. This will be called service name. Excellent. So towards the bottom, when we exit the if conditional, we could say service name is already running. Service name is running. This is the extreme of the if condition. If things are okay, so if MySQL status is equal to 0, it simply comes to this section and says it is running. It won't perform the body. So back to the while loop. While count is less than or equal to threshold, so while 0 is less than or equal to 2, meaning it'll run up to 3 times, do the following. Attempt to start the service. Now immediately after attempting to start the service, we need to run another conditional. This is another conditional. It's considered a nested if-then statement because we need to ascertain the value of the exit status. So if at this stage our magical variable, which is stored in a question mark for exit status, is not equal to 0, so let's set that here. If this so after having or after attempting the initial start of the service, so initially attempting to start the service, after one iteration, if it's still not equal to 0, we need to take some other actions. And we'll show you what they are. So if it's not equal to 0, then we want to increase the count of the count variable. Because remember, we want a while loop to count up to 3. And the while loop is contingent upon the count variable being set at a particular value. Then we'll use the let command, which you've seen us use before. We'll let count be incremented by 1 by specifying plus equal 1, because we want to increase the value of count. Else, simply exit. And we should be tabbing here so you can see it. Simply exit 0. This means that things are running okay. So the nested if-then statement says, if after trying to start MySQL service, if it's still not equal to 0, increase the count by 1. That'll raise count to 1. The while loop will loop again, and it'll run the service start again. If it's still not equal to 0, count will be increased again. Count will then become 2, and that'll be the final iteration of the loop. It'll attempt to start it again. And if after the third iteration, if it fails, then outside of the loop, we need to perform some actions. such as echoing, "I'm sorry it didn't work," or "there are additional problems," etc. So outside of the loop, we should send an email. And that email will be as follows: echo service name, or problems starting service name. Let's say problems starting service name, and we'll send that to the mail command so that we can alert an administrator. And we'll just put a subject of service name. This can be all variabilized. Service name failure, and we'll send it to the root user. And you should try to keep commands such as these on one line just so that it doesn't break, or if in case it gets broken along the way, to avoid errors. So what we're doing here, although it may look a little confusing, to recap, we have a few variables set. The first and most important check that will help us to determine whether or not the service is running is to do a netstat. Netstat will echo for us whether or not things are okay. Based on the status, we'll have it set MySQL status. It may be 0, it may be running. If it is running, great. We have a service name, we have a count, and a threshold. Now, if the status is not equal to 0, because that's what we're really concerned about, then do this while loop that will run from count to threshold. And that'll give us 3 iterations. We can always alter the iterations. Now, in the body of the while loop, we're saying as follows: start the service. If it's still not equal to 0, then increase the count, which moves it from 0 to 1. Else, exit 0. If it is running, we don't need any output. If it's running, great. After 3 iterations outside of the body of the loop, if this has not worked out for us, echo problem starting MySQL D, or service name, send it to the administrator, so at least the administrator can take a look at it. Now we have an else statement for the parent if conditional, where if the MySQL status variable is equivalent to 0, it'll simply echo service name is running and move on with life. And there's one other thing we should do here, which I've mentioned before. Whenever you run commands such as netstat, or any command that produces significant output that you're not interested in other than the error level, send that output to dev null so that it's not displayed. This will help you out a lot, especially if you're logging. Excellent. So we have a lot going on here. Let's attempt to run this and see what happens. We'll source monitor service.shell. Now it gives us an error. And this is quite common. Let's double check. It's missing a token, unexpected token. Let's check it. It says token done. So let's find done. We'll do a Control D to see what's going on here. We have the while, and the while loop begins. It does what it needs to do. It runs the if then. We haven't closed the if then, and that's what's wrong. So the if needs to be closed, and this is where it gets a little confusing because it's all juxtaposed. Let's add a little spacing. So we open nested if. We need to close that nested if. Let's go back to the shell and rerun the service. Excellent. Now it's running. Now, as mentioned before, what you'll run into if you put an exit 0 into a script which itself is not executable is that it does exactly what you see here, which is to actually exit the shell. Remember, when a script is executable and you run it without sourcing it, it creates a subshell. However, if you source it, then the parent shell becomes the shell that you're in. So let's open a window here and fix this problem. We'll change mod u plus x monitor service. And now let's attempt to run monitor service. Excellent. So it returns what we want it to return, which is MySQL D is running. Now, in order to test whether or not this script works, we should stop MySQL D. Let's manually stop MySQL D. And if we were to run the same netstat-ant grep 3306, which we're testing from the script, as you can see, it's not running. And if we echo the exit status, it's 1. Let's rerun the script. Excellent. The script has attempted to start MySQL, and it's run fine. Now, it didn't need to generate output. Let's rerun it. It'll say it's actually running. It didn't need to actually send mail. If we were to run mut, you'll see that we don't have any messages. Let's create a condition where a message needs to be generated. We'll pico monitor service.shell, and what we need to do is change the service name perhaps to something that doesn't exist, such as MySQLD or MySQLDD. We'll append the D to MySQLD, and that's a service that does not exist. Let's attempt to run it. Now MySQLDD comes back nicely because of the following. Port 3306 is running and it's premised on the error level. So let's show you another way to do this. We'll add a port that does not exist, such as 33066, since everything is contingent upon the netstat command. And now it says unrecognized service. What you see here correlates to the 3 iterations of the while loop. 1, 2, 3. And it didn't succeed. Try 3 times. We can keep trying to run it. We're trying to start an invalid service. Now let's run mut to see what messages are there. Here you see all the messages, beginning with the oldest, of MySQLDD failures. Problem starting MySQLDD. We can delete all these messages because they correspond to each iteration. So now what we need to do is just make changes to the file that we have, the monitor service, and what's more important is not necessarily the service name, although it certainly is, because if we do need to start it after failing the netstat test, then the variable that's passed into service is service name. So here you have it. You have a script with a few variables set. This is a very simple script that can do some powerful things. If you want, use positional parameters to control the service name and the port that netstat checks for so that you can have this thing run other services. And then set it up in your cron tab, 1 instance per service, or set up a text file to get the values from. We have one if statement, one major if statement that checks the status of the service. If it's failed, it goes into the while loop. The while loop attempts to start it. If it's still failed, it increases count. This is how we keep track of it. If it's not failed, it just exits. And it keeps going through the loop 3 times, and if there's a problem, it sends a mail. If not altogether, the major if statement or the major if condition just echoes that the service name is functional and running. So we have yet another script that's pretty useful. It's checking one service. It's hardwired to check the MySQL service, but you could always change the script to run from positional parameters so that you can tell it on the fly which service to check and which service to monitor. Or you may still use commercial scripts, but if you can write your own simple script that does some of the same things as more full-fledged scripts, then it's easier for you to read other people's scripts and understand them.